prior to Germany's Holocaust. But what was so surprising was Germany was at that time the peak of cultural center, peak of academic advancements. Freud was there. He was a Jew. He had to run away to England, where he lived the rest of his life. Then Einstein. Einstein was part of, he was a German. But when he went to a conference to America, that is when Hitler had begun his mad run. The Americans did not let him go. They said, be here. And so we still have the relativity theory. But not all of them were so lucky. For Walter Benjamin, he was one of the founders of Frankfurt School. He was escaping from one place to another, and finally he landed in Italy. The next night, his ship was to set sail from the port of Italy to America. But the Nazis came, rounded him. He heard news, and so he committed suicide the very night. We lost Walter Benjamin at a very young age. And the casualty of Hitler's pogrom as Holocaust is immense. It's still incalculable. Among 40 million Jews, 6 million were killed, were mercilessly butchered. But if you go back to analyze why people at different points of time, they go with this bloodthirst, this thirst for killing people mercilessly, not for reasons of annexation, just for the sake of killing. It is still bewildering. It is still bewildering. So, this violence can only be matched with peace. We have a long tradition of peace in the way our freedom struggle was won. And so there is still a hope when there is peace and forgiveness. That is, we do not have answers. So even today, as we go for the paper presentations, we do not have answers. We are not here for solutions, but we are here to see how deep the depravity of man can be, how to what depths can someone fall, and at the same time, to what heights the same human being can also aspire for. So you find a mix of both. That is why one of the main reasons for killing whole scale is generalizing people, generalizing, saying Jews are money minded. This kind of generalization finally led them, made even the normal conscientious Germans also to agree with their killing. So as we are discussing the past, we should also be always open to the fact that we have to treat individuals as an individual and not as a group. When we do as a group, these people are, when we put a general identity over a person, over a people group, then we will not have any qualms about killing them also. If you can hate them, hate is the first step towards murder. So when you can hate them because they belong to such and such a group, they belong to such and such an ethnicity, they belong to such and such a caste, it will not be far away that you can also assent to the murder. So this is what happened. These are the lessons we take from German Holocaust. And also we have seen the African genocides, the Rwanda, the Tutsi. They were part of the same nation but different ethnicities. Again, it is the same thing, the hate which they had within their own countries that led to millions of people being Rwandans and Hutsis being massacred. So we see, but the only antidote is a kind of a forgiveness and seeking for peace. So even as the world with all its nuclear weapons, with all the weapons race, is still going forward to master one another, we still have the message of hope. We still have the message of peace. And this is what I would like to speak to you as a way of introduction. Why do genocides happen? it still happens. We think, we are now moving into a world-class citizens. We do not want to be citizens of one nation, but still, we still have this bloodthirst. We still would want to accept to murder someone. So it is a time of reckoning for all of us individually. Do I have a person whom I can hate for no reason at all? And then I have to rethink what I will give permission to. So I would, with these words of introducing the very concept of genocide, I would also ask the paper presenters, Sriyanka and Jayaprabaa, to present their papers. I think after both the presentations, we can lay open the floor for some discussions. Yes, since Jayaprabha is already there, I would ask her to present. She is working full time. She is a JRF full time scholar working under my guidance. Her work is also on Holocaust literature, and she is working on the disabled people who were how Hitler took the his so-called scientists, medical scientists. They used these Jews as medical rats. She's working on that. But today she will also look into Simon Wiesenthal's Sunflower, a very poignant book. Over to you, Jayaprabha.
Thank you, ma'am. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
A very pleasant good evening to everybody in this forum. Thank you for giving me permission to present such a paper in this theme, genocide. Let me start with the title of this topic, To Forgive or Not to Forgive, the Ethical Dilemmas in Simon Wiesenthal's The Sunflower on the Possibilities and Limits of Forgiveness. This is the content in which I am going to present my paper today. Let me start with the etymology and definition of the term. Since ma'am have told the definition, I'll like to discuss the etymologies of this word. Genocide is derived from a Greek and Latin word meaning race killing. Since I'm limiting myself to Holocaust, I would like to give the exact definition given by the Holocaust Encyclopedia. It refers genocide as the murder of human beings by reason of their belonging to a specific racial, ethnic, or religious group, unrelated to any individual crime on the part of such person. The term was first introduced by Ralph Lemkin in the year 1944. Since the term was introduced in the year 1944, many people associate the term only with Holocaust, but that is not true. Uh, Israel Charney, he is the editor of the Encyclopedia of Genocide. He says genocide refers to all sort of mass murder. Uh, Genocide is a fact of human history right from a long time. That's why we could see many other genocides. Even in the 21st century, we witnessed Elam genocide. But I am limiting myself to Holocaust because it is my research area. I also want to share why did I choose Holocaust for today's theme, genocide. It's because of the uniqueness of the Holocaust. As ma'am said, 6 million Jews were murdered in a very short span of 6 years. 6 years. See, the first gas chamber is actually established in the year 1941. Even before that, many people were killed by various methods. Many people died of starvation and even disease in the camps. As my research is on medical experiments, many victims have been murdered in the name of medical experiments. In fact, 67% of entire European Jewish population has been swept away in the Holocaust time. One should think about the cause and consequence of Holocaust. What is the cause? Just because they belong to the race, a Jewish race, they were murdered. Even Jews themselves didn't know that they were Jews until they were all assimilated and put in a camp. They also did this for acquiring more living space. In fact, leaders propaganda the idea of living space. In fact, they trained many citizens saying that if only they kill many, the more they kill, the better the nation becomes. This was their propaganda. Coming to life writing, there are a number of genres in Holocaust literature, but life writing is the best in reflecting the campus atrocities. Life writing is a broad umbrella term that encompasses many subgenres, including letters, memoirs, diaries, epistles, autobiographies, etc. Second part of my presentation is about Holocaust as intentional genocide. The term intentional genocide was coined by Helen Fein. She is a sociologist. She is a scholar of genocide studies. She coined this term ideological genocide. She defines it as targeted people as undeserving of life, targeting one specific group of people as undeserving of life. Here, the Aryans considered themselves to be the master race, the superior race, and juxtaposes Jews as evil, and they term Jews as the cause for all their misfortune. They, in fact, considered Jews as a burden for their nation. We all know that anti-Semitism exists right from biblical times, but in Hitler's regime, it is termed as redemptive anti-Semitism. The term redemptive anti-Semitism was coined by Saul Friedlander in his book Nazi Germany and Jews. Aryans considered themselves to be the saviors of the nation from the Jewish hands. That's why he coined the term redemptive anti-Semitism. I could also say that Holocaust is a specific intentional genocide. Why I call this as an intentional genocide? Because it is well planned, organized, and prepared. In 1924, when Hitler was in the jail, he wrote his Mein Kampf. Even in that book, he had devised the plan for the extermination of Jews. He planned to annihilate the entire European Jewry. He organized a separate camp for killing. He organized separate camp for workforce. He organized SS members, SA members. He planned everything well in advance. One should also remember that genocide is not a random or spontaneous process. It is a step-by-step process. That is why it can also be defined as systematic methodological elimination of one specific group. As far as preparation is concerned, he established camp outside the city limits because the German society should not know about the atrocities that is done in the camp, and he makes it very accessible. That's why he laid railway tracks so that it will be helpful for easy transportation of Jews. The entire population can be divided into three categories. The first, perpetrators. It represents Nazis who are very active in performing the killing. The second, I will come to victims after finishing bystanders. Bystanders are passive witness people. They'll simply witness and they'll remain indifferent to the imprisonment of Jews. And victims, as ma'am said, these Jews were victimized just because they belong to Jewish race, and they were categorized and segregated based on these four notions, that is nation, race, religion, and ethnicity. One should also understand that genocide is not a war because here victims were unarmed. Unlike in war, they were unarmed and they are not engaged in a military struggle. They were simply imprisoned and they were denied to all sort of basic necessities like education, employment, and possession. When I talk about this, the point 3, it will go for a longer time. So I'm quickly shifting to my next slide. There are many themes that could be researched in the Holocaust studies. I'd like to point very few here. You can do it on anti-Semitism, heroism, resistance, violence, forced labor. You can also talk about collective guilt, cheap grade, survivor's guilt. Out of which I would like to choose the theme of forgiveness here because it is the least explored area. These are some books that focus on forgiveness in the Holocaust. Eva Moses Kos, Surviving the Angel of Death. It's about a medical experiment. It's about medical experiments on twins. She openly forgives by writing a letter to the Nazi. Jodi Picoult, it's actually a novel, The Storyteller. It is written based on the inspiration on the book The Sunflower. I would like to choose the book The Sunflower because it is very important to discuss in a platform like this, which discuss the theme of genocide. I expect that some of you might have read this book earlier, but yet it is a topic of discussion uh, in a theme of genocide. He is Mr. Simon Wiesenthal. I'll give you a quick introduction about him. This is the cover page of the book. When you read the title, The Sunflower, you may think that it is a very joyful book. But when you read the subtitle on the possibilities and limits of forgiveness, you will get to know that this book is related to Holocaust. A quick intro about the author. He is a Jew from Ukraine. He's an architect by profession. He was arrested when Nazi invaded Poland. He served in various concentration camps. He lost almost 89 members of his family. He is very famous for establishing the Center, Jewish Historical Documentation Center. He can be called as Nazi hunter because after the war is over, he dedicated his entire life in documenting the crimes and bringing Nazi criminals to justice. So he was called as Jewish James Bond. In fact, he had bring 1,100 Nazi criminals, out of which Adolf Eichmann. You all know that he is instrumental. He is instrumental in capturing Adolf Eichmann, the man who is responsible for transportation of Jews to the ghettos. And you may be familiar with Karl Jayaprabaa because he arrested Anne Frank. The book is written in German in the year 1969 and it's translated into English in the year 1970. It is divided into two parts. The first part is Sunflower, the second part Symposium. The first part, Sunflower, is the usual archetypal Holocaust memoir where he shares the experience of camps and ghettos. But unlike other memoirs, instead of narrating the entire things that happened in the camp, he focuses only on one particular incident. That is the speciality of this book, The Sunflower. I would like to talk about the significance of Sunflower in Wiesenthal's life. Simon Wiesenthal notices Sunflower in a German graveyard. He saw each German grave was planted with a sunflower, and he sees that butterflies are moving from one sunflower to another. He imagines himself that butterflies are carrying messages from one grave to another. He also symbolizes sunflowers. He says that there is a relationship between God and the dead person in the grave through sunflower. In fact, even the sun rays are lightening the dark German grave. Immediately he mourns for his fellow Jewish men because they are gassed to death. Even the other people who died by other methods were put in a mass grave. Their corpses were piled one above the other, so there won't be any sunflower over the Jewish graves. He feels that even in the very beginning of the memoir, his friend Joseph says that God is on leave today so that he is not seeing the suffering of Jews. He feels always inferior that Germans are getting all the advantage. Even while seeing the sunflower, he feels that Jews are treated as inferior. I started reading this book only because I am impressed with the title, The Sunflower. After reading that only, I get to know that this is the very poignant Holocaust memoir. Quickly, I'll tell some of the book one. The book one constituted only 1/3 of the entire book. He was in the Lemberg camp in the year 1943. It is a true story of a Jewish prisoner, Simon Wiesenthal. Actually, he was assigned to work in a military hospital special for German soldiers, wounded German soldiers, where a nurse compelled Simon Wiesenthal to encounter a dying Nazi in his deathbed. The dying Nazi wants to confess to a Jew because he wants to die in a peace. He keeps remorsing for the crime he's committed against the Jewish community. He recollects one particular incident where he set fire to a building. When he sets fire, one family, a father with his child, jumps out of the window, followed by the mother. Even the jumped ones were shot by the Nazis. The dying soldier, haunted by the screams of men, women, and the children, he could not forget this crime. So he wants to confess to a Jew. That's why he was talking to a Jew, Simon Wiesenthal. I want to talk about the personality of the dying SS man here. He is nearly 21-year-old fellow. He joined Hitler's youth when he was 16 years. Before that, he was a very pious person. He was regular to church. He was a model people in the school. But an ordinary man was converted into a murderer in Hitler's regime. He is an ordinary man, but he was turned into a murderer by a murderous ideology. Even in fact, his father don't like when he joined the SS group. He was hesitant to look at his own son as an SS uniform. But then, the present situation in Germany made many people like this. I would like to read one line from this book. I noticed that a dying man had a warm undertone in his voice as he speak about the Jews. I never heard such a tone in the voice of an SS man. Was he better than the others, or did the voice of an SS man change when they were dying? The book one actually concludes with a quote like, "Should I have forgiven that dying soldier?" Initially, the dying SS man was haunted by the crime that he had done. After that, after hearing through that horror story, Simon, that is the author of this book, was haunted by the encounter and the question he had within himself. That ultimately led him to write the book. That is where the idea of writing a book strikes him, and he wrote this book, The Sunflower. Also, he collected so many responses from from other Jewish victims and survivors. I was telling the story. He was narrating the incident, but Simon remained silent. He did not even utter a word. That shows an act of forgiveness here? He had a mild empathy towards him, but he walked out without speaking a word. What Simon did actually is absolutely correct, because he stand there as a confessor and a listener and left Karl to decide upon his own sins and destiny. During the course, after the war, after the liberation, he went and met that dying soldier's mother. The mother was so happy that somebody comes in search of his son. Although he knows that the person had died already, he just want to meet his mother to know about the Nazi man Karl. It is only from his mother he knows about the complete picture of that personality. He also understands it is only because of the propaganda that a young man like Karl had been brainwashed by the leaders of Nazi regime. Coming to part 2, it is titled as Symposium. As I told you earlier, it is a collection of responses. He had published 53 notable responses from wide group of theologians, writers, psychiatrists, human rights activists, and more. Here I have given few names. When you read the memoir, you feel like you need to forgive the person. But when you read the second part, the real dilemma comes to every reader. I would like to read 2 responses that Simon Wisenthal has mentioned in his book. First, I would like to read Primo Levi's. You all know that he is a Italian chemist and Holocaust survivor. He says, Wisenthal did the right thing by denying the prisoner's forgiveness. Even in his deathbed, the soldier called for a Jew, not Simon. Again, the Jew here is objectified, treated as a subhuman, used as a tool, a gift to the superhuman absolution. The next response I want to read here is Desmond Tutu. He is a Nobel Peace Prize winner and a leading voice against apartheid in South Africa. He is for forgiving. He says, without forgiveness, there is no future. So the dilemma continues to exist throughout his lifetime. Here comes the problematics of forgiveness. When I read the responses, when I read the book, I could trace a pattern in those responses. I come up with the question, did religion have a role in the act of forgiveness? Because all the Christian and Buddhist are for forgiveness and Jews towards justice. Forgiveness is a very Christian faith. It's a bedrock of Christian faith, I could say. I want to quote one line from Bible here, from Epistle first epistle of John, first epistle of John, it says, and if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous. And he himself is the propitiation for for our sins, and not for us only, but also for the whole world. So we come to know that forgiveness is basically a Christian faith, and so many Christians favor for forgiveness. Even Wisenthal also says in this book that Karl, a dying SS man, he repented truly. He himself agrees a true repentance of the dying Nazi man. I quote, Wisenthal says, he writes, there was a true repentance, even though he did not admit in so many words, nor was it necessary, for the way he spoke and the fact that he spoke to me was a proof of his true repentance. At the same time, the other notion also exists. Some people says that he is not a priest to forgive the sins of others, or else he is not in a position to forgive on behalf of others. Here, I would like to quote from the book. Uh, his fellow, Joseph, I told you, his fellow inmate says that what people have done to you yourself, you can, if you like, forgive and forget. That is your own affair. But it would have been a terrible sin to burden your conscience with other people's suffering. So, in fact, Carl, the dying SS man, turned the morality upside down. Then how can we expect that Simon Wiesenthal to morally forgive the Nazi? In the same Bible, also from Proverbs 28:17, there is a verse I'll read here. If one is burdened with the blood of another, he will be a fugitive until death. Let no one help him. This is also said in the Bible. While taking decision about either to forgive or not to forgive, one should keep in mind about the injustice done to the Jewish community. I would like to conclude by saying the need to have such a topic on genocide help us to understand that all human lives are sacred, and by identifying and defining the elements, we are possibly able to prevent the next genocide. It also helps us to think and preserve fellow human beings. This is the books I have referred for this presentation. I thank Tantam for giving me such an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jayaprabaa, for a very detailed presentation. I would now call upon Ms. Sriyanka to give her presentation. You should excuse me for not introducing you properly. I ask that you will introduce yourself and go ahead with your presentation. Over to you, Ms. Sriyanka.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Sriyanka. I am at present an independent scholar working in the field of environmental humanities. In terms of, just a second, let me just share my screen. One second, please. My presentation, hello, am I audible? Hello?
Yes, you are.
Thank you so much. My presentation on genocide is a bit different from what the previous speaker has spoken. She did an excellent job in explaining and exploring the mass killing associated with genocide. However, I take the word genocide into a different direction in exploring cultural genocide in First Nation communities in Canada. And my primary focus in this paper will be to understand and give a glimpse of the impact of uh, cultural genocide, especially on the relationship of man and environment, since environment is one of the uh, hotshot topics at this moment. So my presentation is titled Lost Trails, Uprooted Memories, Exploring Genocide in First Nation Communities in Canada. Resilience from the oppressions of settler colonialism for the First Nation communities in Canada begins with the act of remembrance, revisiting the traumatizing past of genocide. The unpacking of the term genocide in the Canadian context is a complex procedure, as it involves understanding the annihilation of culture of the Aboriginal communities. The international law, United Nations, defines genocide as the violence committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. But it fails to identify the cultural devastation it brings upon the indigenous communities. The European settler colonization established residential school systems and designed policies that intended to eradicate the indigenous culture, languages, and traditions. The residential school system, which began in the 1880s, funded by the government and run by church clergymen, focused on the destruction of indigenous culture by removing children away from their reservations and severing their relationships with the parents in order to educate them with Christian values and the colonizers' culture. Further, policies like the Gradual Act Civilization in 1857 was created to assimilate indigenous people to the European settler community society by providing them free land grants to male indigenous people who received education in the colonizers' established schools. Additionally, the Indian Act in 1876 allowed the government to control indigenous political structures, economic and cultural rights of the First Nations. Moreover, in the 1920s, attending residential schools became mandatory, otherwise which parents would be sent to jail. Such policies ensured that Native children were stripped from their indigenous identities to become like the colonizer. Daniel
Sorry
Kennedy,
to interrupt, Ms. Priyanka. Are you
yes,
changing the slides? We
yes,
don't
I
see
am.
your, but we
Uh,
don't see your slides changing here. It's in the first
um,
slide.
do you see it now?
Ah, yes, yes. Now we see the Indian Act is there.
Then is the screen visible? I guess if I wait, if
Yeah, now we can see the Indian Act.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
okay,
You can, if you are
okay,
in this slide, please go ahead.
yeah. So as I was talking about the residential schools
Yeah.
becoming mandatory. A very famous author, Canadian author, Duncan Campbell Scott, who played an instrumental role in creating this act where residential schools should become mandatory. Okay, so and now, okay, now Daniel Kennedy, who belongs to the Okeechobee, pardon my pronunciation, recounts his experience at the Coapella Residential School, and he writes in his memoir, Recollections of an Anishboyne Chief, 1972, that he was tied up in a rope and forcefully taken to the residential school, where he lost his native name, was stripped of his indigenous clothing, and his braids were cut off, which in Assiniboine traditional system was a token of mourning. And I read from the passage: the closer the relative, the closer the cut. After my haircut, I wondered in silence if my mother had died, as they had cut my hair loose, close to the scalp. Uh, uh, a little later in the paragraph, as we read, he says, realizing that there was no escape, I resigned myself to the task of learning the 3 R's. Visualize for yourself the difficulties encountered by the Indian boy who had never seen the inside of a house, who had lived in a buffalo skin tepees in winter and summer, who grew up with a bow and arrow. Now, there are several other accounts of brutalities done to native children in residential schools. And if we look at Canadian news at this moment, we would see every day news where residential schools across cities are being brought up, and even the Canadian government is apologizing for its horrendous past. However, uh, uh, the students, after they left these governmental schools, were traumatized by the violence, so much so that they became disoriented, and they could neither adjust to the colonizers society, and now they were able to return back to practicing their own native customs and traditions. The loss of native identity through cultural dissociation had profound impacts on aboriginal communities that left their impression across generations. One such consequence was the loss of traditional ecological knowledge system, which encompassed the worldview and cultural practices of the indigenous communities. Anderson defines traditional ecological knowledge as the product of keen observation, patience, experimentation, and long-term relationships with plants and animals. It was a knowledge built on history, gained on many generations of learning, passed down by elders, such as about practical as well as spiritual practices. Such practices involve storytelling, literature, and creation stories found in indigenous repertoire of stories, and experience oriented communal activities like fishing, hunting, and picking eatable berries while hiking through trails. The indigenous philosophy harbored the idea of, in Thomas King's words, all my relationships, the bond shared between nature, living beings, non living entities, and spirits. The entire universe is considered as one entity and is communicative. The understanding of this dynamic and cyclic knowledge system cannot be learned with the constricted residential school structure of the colonizer. At present, when the ecological crisis is haunting us, it is both ironic and interesting to study the present attention given to traditional ecological knowledge. The colonials, who in the past forcefully obliterated the oral knowledge system, are now carefully considering the indigenous practice of balance between mankind and nature. To understand the traditional ecological knowledge system further, I will explore two poems by Okanagan author Janet Armstrong. First, Winged Woman, a poem deeply invested in the traditional belief system of the native people. Because of time limitations, I won't be reading the entire poem. The poem underlines the importance of village elders, here Maggie, who plays a crucial role in preserving the traditional culture which is slowly fading away because children are taken away from their reserves and are unable to participate in such berry picking activities. The children in native communities symbolize the living repertoire of knowledge system who learn and pass on this knowledge to future generations. We see in the poem, I listen. If we read a few, just focusing on a few lines, I listened as she talked in a language, half singing sometimes, for all the pickers to hear. Her voice high and clear in the crisp mountain air, said about Coyote. I know how the trees talk. I said to Maggie, I heard them mourning in the night, while we lie so tiny in a tents with those tall back spines swaying over us. Moving on, there's another important line that I want to focus on. Maggie told me that I had heard the winged woman sing. She told me that I would remember that song always because the trees were my teacher. The indigenous philosophy that nature was your guide, that nature would guide you in your pathways, that is what is being depicted by Armstrong in this poem. Tamara Starblanket Cree from Akantatok Tree Nation in an interview states, our nation depends on our children to transmit our languages, spirituality, cultures, laws about our societies and relationships with each other, and most importantly, our lands and our identity and responsibility. However, instead, massive patterns of trauma and confusion, sorrows and pain are passed on, severely impeding our original nation's ability to perpetuate ourselves for the next 7 generations. What Armstrong highlights is remembrance. Remembrance, thus, in this poem becomes an act of reclamation. The memories of the past reconstitute the native identity. Again, in history lessons, Armstrong tries to subvert the official history available in the textbooks in Canada with the image of sarcasm and wit. The reference to Christopher Columbus stresses on the politics of discovering the Indians, denying their existence from the official recorded history. When colonizers first landed, the first thing they did was to destruct natural resources by cutting down trees and killing animals, uh, running in all directions, pulling furs off animals, shooting buffaloes, shooting each other left and right. Again, we see civilization has reached the promised land. Between the snack, crackle, and pop of smokestacks and multicolored rivers swelling with flour powdered Z, and our farmers sowing skulls and bones, and miners pulling from gaping holes green paper faces of smiling English lady. The multi With civilization came industrialization, disrupting the creation of Mother Nature. The multicolored rivers symbolizes polluted rivers, disrupting the traditional fishing practices, and mining activities created ecological imbalances, creating signifying the environmental disasters caused by the colonizers. Kyle White, in Settler Colonialism, Ecology and Environmental Justice, opines that settler colonial domination had disrupted the relationship between humans and the environment. The climate crisis observed today serve as deja vu to indigenous communities who were displaced from their lands and were forced to adapt to colonial practices. The change in the landscape through deforestation, water pollution, and relocation of native communities highlight the impact of settler colonialism. Finally, a deliberate attempt on Armstrong's part is made here to invoke the Christian rhetoric of the garden. Somewhere among the remains of the skinless animals is the termination to a long journey and unholy search for the power glimpsed in a garden, forever closed, forever lost. The garden is here used as a Christian rhetoric. The ambition from the Garden of Eden is transferred to the lands of Canada. If Wint woman delineates the practice of the traditional knowledge system, then history lesson explains the need to follow it. In one of Armstrong's novels, Whispering in Shadows, the protagonist Penny remarks, I don't think there's enough research on the fact that Native people understand real sustainability and practice it even on small reserves left of their homelands. Indeed, not enough research has been done in the understanding of sustainability in terms of indigeneity, but modern day Western ecologists are now realizing the potential of indigenous knowledge and in conserving the environment. Meanwhile, indigenous activists like Janet Armstrong, through their literary works, attempt to inform the significance of the practice of traditional ecological knowledge systems in preserving the environment. Writing itself becomes an act of decolonization, the attempt to untether from the trauma of cultural genocide in order to reclaim the lost indigenous identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms.Sriyanka, for a very scholarly presentation on that. Now we have two papers. One has discussed the Holocaust and the um, space of forgiveness with that, and we also have this cultural genocide. So we can just have an interaction sessions. Um, those who are asking questions, I would just request you to put on your video so we will just see some faces. Also
Uh,
hear you speak. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. This is Sadhana, Laura.
Hello, Sadhana. Yeah, please go
Sorry,
ahead.
I couldn't enable my video for some
Uh,
reason.
okay.
I actually I would like to augment few, points suggested by the first scholar, Jayaprabaa. Yeah, with her genocidal points, and she was using this word intentional genocide, by Helen Faines. Yeah, it's right because. Uh, Nazism encouraged the practice of initially the dislike of the unlike, and later the hatred became so intense. They hated the Jews not because they were different, but they felt the Jews were trying to become like them. Actually, I would say it was not accidental. Destroying the Jews was not accidental byproduct of Nazism. Instead, I can even say, no, it's the inmost essence of Nazism. They were neither allowed to, assimilate, nor were they, allowed to maintain their ethnicity. But still, they were accused for both. As she rightly put, no, it was organized. The crime, or you can even say the whole genocide was so organized that they were mass executed not only in the chambers are still in the memory of the readers, like most of us just remember Auschwitz, but to give the gas chambers starts from Treblinka, Sobibor, Mazdanek, Kelmo, Belzec, everything. It was a kind of, you can say, it was a full scale genocide using innovations, as you said rightly, modern science and engineering. Everything was used only for this purpose. Approximately, as you said, 6 million Jews were perished only because of this, the modern thinking of genocide, and that was so organized. That's what, that's the reason why, even though Jews were able to forgive this act of genocide or whatever, the whole world is not willing to forgive them. Because it's so uncommon. They're I mean, as one particular writer, I think it's Flannery, he rightly put it, communism came and went, and fascism came and went, but anticism came and stayed, he said. That it still remains in the memory of almost all the people in the world, because the hatred was so powerful and passionate, and it's still existing, maybe in different forms. So I just wanted to add few more points to her essay. The actually, they were hated for stubbornly maintaining their separateness, but still, when they were trying to assimilate, they thought they became the threat to their racial purity, especially through intermarriages and all those things. And other thing I would like to say, the sufferings, as she was actually mentioning, that nobody came to talk about their the other side of this thing, the reparation side of the genocides. I felt actually some literature, whenever the specific problems were when literature dealt about the specific problems of Holocaust, I felt the validity and merit were questioned, because many historians and writers about the Holocaust, they felt they had different attitudes towards and approaches towards responding to Holocaust. Now, Steiner said Holocaust should be conveyed only through silence, because their response to Holocaust, especially Jews' response to Holocaust, was more psychological rather logical. And whatever the reparations the world was able to give the Jews was only political. It was not the other way. And so it was so intense. But the persons like Albert Camus, they felt to talk about the despair is to conquer it. They felt the other way. You have to talk, and you have to conquer that way. So as she can add these points also to her, to strengthen up her arguments. And that's what I wanted to convey, because Jews are always seen as a mysterious uh, group of people, and still they are. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sadhna. Dr. Sadhna's thesis was on Mordecai Rickler, a Canadian Jew, and so her insights also add up to the discussion. Yeah, it's true. It started as a rhetoric of anti-Semitism only very recently. From main camp to the concentration camps, it was barely 15 years, but he could conquer the entire psyche of German people and made them convinced that it is necessary to kill all the Jews, not only of Germany and Poland, but Hungary, Romania, Italy, France, all the European Jews he could collect and kill them. Yeah, that is
Yeah.
something, we still cannot get over. And yes,
Yeah,
thank you.
and regarding the second, scholars, work on indigenous people, and that's right. She talked about the genocide, and she also talked about the rest of the people who are left or who are left to live in that European predominant world in Canada. They were promised of so many things, like so many treaties were there laid between the indigenous people and the Europeans, but still, no, the promises were not kept, and that was even worse than the genocide. There were so many, more than 11 treaties were, between the Inuits and Mohawks and all these people and the Europeans, but still, the promises were not kept. Initially, they were, promised to. With the large reserves of land, just good to each and every people. If for example, if there is a family of five, some amount of 160 acres were reserved lands were given to them. Slowly, they fought for it, and it got increased to 640 acres, and slowly it got shrunk again. And finally, they had to go beg for. They felt very cheated. No, they have to go beg for the, at least no a hunting of buffalo hunting, all these things, because they are starving for their food. And this was even worse than the genocide. People were killed deliberately, and these were left to live just like that. And this is an important aspect. No, people who are living uh, have to bear the pangs of genocide, as well as uh, uh, to disown your honor or something for the just for the sake of food or something. Leave alone the other things. Yeah, that was another important aspect. Now, that's the reason why Janet Armstrong's literature is full of, it starts with the love for landscape and going back for cultural, uh, love, and bring back, reinstate the culture again, by bringing back the love for the land and love for the landscape. Most of her poems, she speaks to the landscape, and she feels as if the landscape is talking to her, and she sees her forefathers in the landscape. And that was another important point I wanted to tell. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I?
Yeah.
Yeah, please,
Yes.
Thank you,
yeah.
Sadhna ma'am, for that, for putting my words into a beautiful perspective. The promise of the land. I just want to say one thing, like if the previous paper, like you highlighted, focused on the focused on genocide because they did not want to intermingle, they did not want to lose the purity of the race, while my paper focused on how the genocide focused on stripping away that identity, the opposite contrast, where where they were forcefully stripping identity to make them like the colonizers. I think that is a beautiful diabolic
Yes. Yeah.
perspective of the genocide from two aspects.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, I listened to both the speakers, and both of them have done their work. I mean, done their work very well. They presented very well. Thank you. In both the Jewish, the Holocaust of the Jews, and also the colonial encounter, and the resultant identity loss and genocide of the original aborigines. Okay, the same thing happens even in Australia, But I was actually, I thought today there'd be a paper on something from Africa. So much in our own times we had. I think a chairperson can throw some light on the genocides that have happened in Africa. Africa always is a dark continent, and nobody seems to want to focus on that kind of things that go there. Such terrible, savage killings going on there. There are so many tribes in Africa. I think so many of them between the colonizers and the rulers of the other, I mean, of other communities in Africa itself. There is a lot of genocide going on. And what does the rest of Africa think about it? Before the rest of the world thinks about it, I just wonder. So could you, if you have any idea about what's happening in Rwanda and what's the other place, the Darfur, can you throw some light on it, Mrs. Laura?
Yeah, actually, as I just came just through certain things on Rwandan genocide, that was a genocide which was just for 100 days. And, at least um, 11 million were killed in those 100 days.
Yes.
That was between the people of the same nation, Rwanda, between two groups, ethnic groups, between Tutsi and Hutu, these two tribes. One was, but I don't believe that it is only Africa was like that. See the case of Germany. Germany was the most advanced, and they used the advanced technology to kill so efficiently. So I think the blood, the violent streak runs across the continents, across the nations, and that is why Jayaprabaa was also throwing that forgiveness piece up as
Yeah.
opposed to bloodshed. Everywhere you only have to look around and see certain things we do not know. But when we go to other countries, Latin America, the Colombia, you have a lot of genocides that have happened there all across the world. You go to Vietnam, Cambodia, their own Pol Pot killed his own people. So many, he has killed his own countrymen and women. So you see genocides happening everywhere. I think the violence, there is a thirst for violence in humankind, and we have to educate. Peace comes by learning and by teaching. The violence comes naturally, I think. That is why this is the ethical dilemma is still there.
Okay,
Dr.
I
Laura?
think yes, that's one. Yes, that's one perspective. I think yes. I think can we call? I mean, in this age when we are all so civilized, we call ourselves. Can we say that this is? I mean, this kind of maybe it's just like the hunger for money. Can we simulate? I mean, make a kind of a comparison to what the corporates are doing to the little people, that kind of, to exterminate a group, so that in the market, what the market is doing, global market is doing to smaller people. Can some kind of comparison be made in this?
I don't know.
I
We
mean,
have to think about it.
yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Laura, can I say a few things?
Yes, yes.
Few-
Go ahead, Dr.
yeah,
Pinky.
yeah. Just in, keeping in mind my first PG and second PG students, a few key words. So in case of what they call the Holocaust, the massacre of the annihilation of the Jews, one key word would be German nationalism, right? And when you think of, so it's that Hitler kept spreading this thing about Germans being a superior race, so that nationalism thing is there. And the parallel to that in terms of the colonial agenda would be imperialism. So that's what accounted for the cultural genocide in Australia and Canada, this separation of children from their families, institutionalization, trying to wipe out the race. Not in a very radical way like the way the Germans did it, but in a systematic. Okay, it was both systemic and systematic. Systemic, it was part of their system, it was part of their ideology. And we must remember that the Germans and the British were competitors in race science. There was so much of competition between them, and that's how this Darwinian theory is very much behind the whole thing about the survival of the fittest. And then you'll come across the term social Darwinism and all these things. Well, if you have to read up on that. So if you have to just get a small intro, I'd suggest that you read the United Nations definition on genocide. You can just log in and see. So you genocide definition, and you get the United Nations one, and there's a list given there. There are 4 different definitions. There's a kind of checklist there. You can go through that. And then since Srilata ma'am brought up Africa, well, Africa also, genocide was there. But it was from Africa also, because of the African National Congress, you had the reconciliation movement. So since Jayaprabaa was talking about peace and forgiveness and all these things, in Australia, the stolen generations, well, their trauma and all they expressed. But from the 1990s, you had the reconciliation movement, and there also this transnational influence is there. They got the idea of a reconciliation movement in Australia because of the reconciliation movement that was started by Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu in Africa. And in relation to reconciliation, I think you might be knowing the story of Laslong and Jesse Owens. So you can look up Laslong and Jesse Owens' story. It is a classic story of friendship in bad times, in times of prejudice. So Laslong was this German sportsman, and Jesse Owens representing America, and Laslong was back, whole of Germany was waiting to see Laslong defeat Jesse Owens. And in the pre-finals, Jesse Owens missed the mark. And Laslong came up to him and said, why don't you stand a few feet away and then, leap? And Jesse Owens made it to the finals, and Jesse Owens won the gold, and Laslong won the silver, much to the disappointment of the Germans. But the whole world speaks about the friendship between Laslong. It has gone into history, the friendship between Laslong and Jesse Owens, and it's there in many English textbooks also, the story of Laslong and Jesse Owens. So I just thought I'd give this kind of input about love, peace, and reconciliation. Thank you.
Yeah, I've just put it in the chat, the apology of Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd to the Aborigines. It's a very, very powerful YouTube video. I just, to end on a very optimistic note, we know that violence exists. We know that so much of evil is there, but still when you take one step for peace, this is so moving, how peace and apology and forgiveness can make. Dr. Preeti, can we have more questions, or what is the time limit?
We usually close at this time, ma'am. Unless there's someone who feels that they were not given an opportunity, they can ask.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, this was a very enlightening moment, and also we brought together on the table so many things to discuss and to ponder over. Before I give my closing remarks, I will just kind of clarify certain things. In Germany, the Jews were all assimilated. They were not having their identity as Jews. In fact, many of them were surprised to even realize they were Jews. That came from the nation, their identity from the roll call. That is how Germans separated them. And they were surprised. Freud was an assimilated Jew. Einstein was an assimilated Jew. And the Jews did not maintain racial purity. That was Hitler's idea of Aryan. He wanted to establish a so-called Puritan, pure identity. And that was again fallacious idea, for which he made Jews a scapegoat. So just wanted to clarify these both. And I'm thankful for both the presenters for bringing so many ideas for us to think, as whenever we come together, we discuss ideas. And it also has to lead towards a a positive outgrowth in us. We know so many things exist. We know evil exists. We know violence exists. But then, we also, on the other hand, can speak of forgiveness. We can still speak of peace despite the Holocaust. We can still speak of reconciliation. And these are the things that we have to work after. And with these things, I place on record my gratitude to the presenters and also Dr. Preeti Srinivasan for having asked me to chair this wonderful engagement with young scholars, and also my thanks to Dr. Srilata and Dr. Sadhana. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prabha. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you
Yeah,
for this
thank you,
opportunity.
Sriyanka. Yes,
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think there'll be a formal vote of thanks. Am I right?
Shriyanka, what are you working on?
Ma'am, at present I am an independent scholar. My focus is actually environment and the relationship of, it's an intersectional study of environmental humanities and digital media, actually.
From Bangalore? Are you from Bangalore?
No, I'm from Kolkata. I did my MPhil
Okay.
from Jadavpur University, preparing for PhD.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. We had an interesting discussion. I thank the chairperson and the paper presenter for the valuable contribution. I thank the teachers and scholars for being part of this learning platform. Thank you all. We will meet you again after a fortnight on 3rd December 21 at 6 p.m. The topic of our next symposium is Gay and Lesbian Studies. Do stay with us on this journey of the learning. Thank you, everyone.